Thank you, everyone. This is, by the way, the first public presentation of my book. I saved it for you. The book is not out until February. I don't even have a copy myself. That's why I'm going to have to read from my laptop a little bit. And to be honest, I haven't quite figured out how I'm going to talk about this book. It covers a lot of ground. And there's something for everyone to hate in this book. I promise you there will be parts of this that you don't agree with. Maybe not today, but in the content of the book. It's impossible not to say something about gender, sex, sexuality, or relationships, which is what the book's about. It's impossible to say anything about those matters without pissing somebody off, right? And I do try to keep it to the science. I try to keep it to the biology. But I can't resist interpreting some of this. So, I've got a little soapbox, so I'm going to use it. But let me tell you a little bit about what inspired the book. It actually comes out of 2 chapters of a book that I wrote a decade ago about animal bonding, animal attachment, and the sex lives of animals. And the reason why I was able to make a whole book out of that is so little has changed when it comes to the public conversation on these topics. And we have heard so much from so many different fields, and I'm still waiting for biology to really come in there and help remind everyone that these are actually biological behaviors, biological traits, and the field of biology has been doing a lot of really good work on this. However, the field of biology, and this is why why I'm going to couch it this way for this particular community, the skeptical community, the field of biology is in the midst of, but still has a lot of work toward, getting rid of its own biases. A lot of work on animal behavior was very much colored by the biases that the scientists brought towards watching animals. And almost every chapter of my book, I give space to explaining how wrong we were about some things. Partially is scientists can always learn from our mistakes and be humbled by being reminded that we do have a perspective that we bring to our work, and that perspective can change the way that we interpret things. And in fact, the first article that I wrote promoting the book is going to be out in the magazine Free Inquiry, which I imagine many of you read or are aware of. It's a great magazine. Most of the people who read it are going to hate what I say in this article. But I don't care. I want to take this conversation right to the skeptical community, because even though they're going to reject some of what I have to say, it is my natural home. I did burst onto the public scene in my fight against creationism in schools and in the public. And I think that evolutionary education would really help a lot. Anyway, the inspiration for this book is this moment of big upheaval that we're going through. And that's really where I got the title of the book, is Sexual Evolution. Obviously, it's a play on the sexual revolution from the 1960s. What we're going through now makes that pale in comparison, right? And I think it's obviously very unsettling to people. But let me read a little bit from the introduction, because I think it captures it well. And the title of this section of the introduction is A Question of Labels. There's no question that we are living through a time of great upheaval. Societies around the world are bitterly divided along social and political lines on issues from the environment, immigration, globalism, the list goes on. But according to many, the most dangerous threat of all is the increasing abandonment of traditional notions of sex, gender, and sexuality, and the resulting collapse of the traditional nuclear family. Now, when I use the term traditional, I simply mean the views that have dominated the world for most of the last few centuries. For generations, we've been taught that biological sex is a simple matter. Men are men and women are men, or women are women. For generations, we've been taught that. We've been told that men should be attracted only to women and vice versa. That romantic dating was aimed at the goal of finding a spouse as quickly as possible. That sexual intercourse should only occur between married couples and with the main goal of making babies. And that marriage should be permanent and focused primarily on the raising of children. These were not presented as aspirational ideals, but rather as the correct way of doing things. And deviation from any of this, we were told, was aberrant, disordered, and unnatural. Which, by the way, was the first title of my book, Unnatural. But it didn't fly. The times, they are a-changing. More and more of us, especially young people, are taking an open-minded approach to gender and sexuality that goes far beyond identifying as gay or transgender, which were the pioneering deviant groups of the 20th century, Terms such as gender fluid and gender non-binary are gaining momentum. Young adults are increasingly identifying as pansexual, demisexual, or even asexual, rather than just plain old gay, straight, or bi. Conventional categories for gender identity and expression and sexual attraction and romanticism are just not cutting it anymore. The ever-growing litany of categories for gender and sexuality are giving way to a free-for-all called no labels, an approach that eschews any restrictive definitions whatsoever. Sexual and romantic relationships are changing as well. Many young adults have no intention of getting married. Consensual non-monogamy is on the rise. Birth rates are plummeting. In just 2 generations, the sexual landscape has completely changed throughout most of the developed world. And so it's no surprise that many people find this terribly unsettling. What is surprising to me, however, is how little the biology of sex has factored into this public conversation. After all, sex, gender, and sexuality are first and foremost biological traits. Of course, there are psychological, social, political, and even legal ramifications for these issues, but I think we've all heard plenty from those perspectives already. I think it's time for biology to have a seat at the table, and with this book, I am forcefully pulling up a chair. I assert that this moment of sexual turmoil is actually a rediscovery of a much more expansive relationship with sex that our ancestors once had and that other animals enjoy today. I use the word ancestors to refer to both human societies of our prehistoric past, millions of years, or thousands of years, and the primate ancestors of our deep past, millions of years. To make this argument, I will explore what we observe in other animals in diverse contemporary human societies, as well as what we can infer from our forebears in the ancient world. The key to taking an unbiased look is to set aside preconceived notions the best we can and look deeply with an open mind, as I've tried to do here. Implicit in this thesis is the notion that much of how we humans express our sexuality and how we form our sexual relationships stems from cultural constructions, not innate biological wiring. As we will see, even a cursory glimpse of the sex lives of other animals demolishes any notion that sexual activity is narrowly purposed toward procreation. Biologists have discovered an ever-expanding list of reasons that animals have sex with each other. Animals use sex for bonding, for social cohesion, for alliance building. They use sex deceptively, competitively, and financially. They even have sex for the same reason that we most often do, just for the fun of it. Moreover, in no other species but humans is sex rigidly restricted by broad constructions such as heterosexuality, sexual monogamy. Nor was it so restricted in most of our own history. A reimagining of those constructions doesn't seem so crazy when we consider how peculiar and recent they really are. Animals masturbate, they enjoy oral sex, gay sex, and group sex. They engage in extramarital sex, and they struggle to manage the jealousy that often accompanies it. As humans explore this supposedly new sexual territory, perhaps we can look to our animal cousins for guidance on how to manage this minefield of social upheaval. I'm not joking. Traditionally, the question of why we have sex and with whom was answered more by cultural values than the biological underpinnings of this behavior. But in my view, it's long past time that we bring science into this discussion. And there are 2 ways in which the field of biology can teach us about ourselves. First, a look at the natural history of sex helps to place this interesting behavior in its full evolutionary context. While it is not my claim, important is the important point, while it is not my claim that the behaviors of non-human animals are the sole or even best foundation for moral reasoning, please remember that. Studying animals can demystify our own behavior and reduce harmful taboos. Second, by fully understanding the various reasons why animals have sex and what they gain from it from themselves and others, we can more fully appreciate the many social facets of it and help contextualize sex among our other needs. And then that's enough from the introduction, because I don't want to spend too long on that. But what I want to just say is this last thing before I go on to some specific examples. Be warned. If you're attached to your own prejudices about gender or sexuality, this book may unsettle you. In these pages, you will learn that other animals have been experimenting with gender expression for millions of years. You will see how intersex bodies are nothing new or scary. You will appreciate that sexual diversity is not and was never solely about procreation. You will learn why sexual monogamy is nearly unheard of throughout the animal kingdom. You will grapple with the many human societies in which our contemporary sexual taboos had no place. At the same time, you will be amused at early attempts to explain homosexuality in humans. You will be haunted by how transgender individuals navigated a world ill-suited for them. And you will wonder just how the hell we got things so wrong. Just 2 generations ago, we literally demanded that teenagers agree to marry someone permanently and exclusively without ever having seen them naked, let alone developed an intimate or romantic attachment to them. So I think it's okay that the pendulum might be swinging the other way. Okay, so I'm going to now go on and try to give you a couple of examples. So these questions form the foundation of the first 5 chapters of the book, which are almost exclusively about animals. I really don't discuss humans except for with humorous asides. I do try to write with a lot of humor just to make it fun, because that's the way I teach. So what is sex? What does it mean to be a male? What does it mean to be a female? Way, way, way more complicated than you can imagine. Now, you might be one of those people who's immediately like, sperm and eggs, binary, that's all there is. Okay, so first of all, even that leaves out the hermaphrodites, which is the majority of animal species can do that, and other kinds of sex determination as well. But my point is, if you only consider sex a matter of sperm and eggs, then what you're talking about is gametic sex, and you're centralizing or centering the gonads above every other tissue in your body. And for me, it seems to me that our entire body is sexed in some ways. But what you see with the sexual dimorphism throughout our body is a bimodal distribution, not a binary one. And in all of those measures, all throughout your body, there is overlap between the sexes. And in fact, I bet everyone, or close to everyone in this room, has some measure on your physical body in which you fit more on the female side than the male side, or vice versa. We're all a mosaic of these sexually dimorphic traits. Except when it comes to sperm and egg, pretty much everything else in our body is bimodal, including our brain, by the way. You might have a male typical hippocampus, but you might have a female typical corpus callosum, and so forth. So if you look at the whole body as sexed, which I think we should, because what matters in your daily life? Your sperm and egg, or everything else about you, right? So if you consider the whole body sexed, then actually we have much more of a bimodal distribution than you probably realize, including and especially in the genital anatomy, which is what everybody seems to care about. Gender, of course, flows from sex, but is not purely reducible to sex, and I will talk about the construction of gender in animals, in different kinds of males, different kinds of females, and what that means. Of course, I'll talk about sexual attraction and the ways in which animals approach sex. And skipping monogamy for a second, I'll also talk about the various things that we get out of our sexual interactions, much more than just union of sperm and eggs, right? In fact, that happens less than 0.001% of the time that we have sex, right? And that's true for plenty of other animals too. So they're doing it all the time. What are all those other reasons? And when you understand those reasons, you can also see why these other categories are not so hardly defined or strictly defined. And then, of course, what is monogamy? And I'd like to start with that question first here, because it's an excellent example of how scientific bias stopped us from seeing the natural world as it really is. So now I'm going to jump to the chapter on monogamy. I titled this chapter Monogamish, which was a term coined first by Dan Savage. And I love that wordplay of monogamish, because this tendency to want to form dyads is pretty universal in human culture, right? But what we think of monogamy has nothing to do, or little to do, with the formation of dyads. It has to do with who you have sex with. The fact that those two things were joined together into one concept is exactly the problem we have in communicating about it. Chapter 4. Prior to the late 1980s, it was believed that when birds form stable breeding pairs, they are sexually faithful to each other, at least most of the time. In other words, it was assumed that most birds were monogamous. These are the chapters of the book. So you see, I go through those 5 questions, all with animals, and then I get into humans. So the last 3 chapters are all about humans. And then, of course, you wait for me to get up on my soapbox. So you have to wait till page 277 to tell you what I really think.
which, by the way, I'll give away the conclusion is, I don't know what the hell to do with this either. Prior to the late 1980s, it was believed that birds were monogamous. Once a bird couple has formed, they work together cooperatively to build a nest, incubate the eggs, and care for the hatchlings until they can fly off on their own. Which means that the couple spend most of their time together, separating only to provision food or nesting materials and other work essential to their shared goal of producing as many offspring as possible. For this reason, birds have been held up as an ideal for coupling, lifelong commitment to family, and sexual fidelity. The expression love birds and love nest come to mind. This view of bird monogamy began to change upon the arrival of DNA-based paternity testing for birds, beginning with the indigo buntings in 1987 and the Sundra zebrafish in 1988. I'll show you a picture of those in just one second. One by one, ornithologists began subjecting hatchlings of their favorite bird species to genetic scrutiny, and, like an episode of the Murray Ostrich show, the DNA results came back shouting, "You are not the father." Oh, sorry, I was supposed to, you can see this is my first time with this. Tales of Scientific Bias in a font that you don't have. But anyway, you guys remember this, right? Tales from the Crypt. So this is Tales of Scientific Bias, and I'm just going to give you stories of bias. Anyway, this is the Murray Ostrich show. My illustrator came up with this. I thought that was pretty clever. So basically, once we actually started looking at these bird nests, what we found is almost all the nests have at least one hatchling that is not the biological offspring of at least the male, sometimes of either one. What the DNA testing showed was, more often than not all of the hatchlings of a given bird pair were the genetic progeny of the male. The specifics vary widely among different species, but what biologists started to discover everywhere is called extra-pair paternity, or EPP, which is the natural result of extra-pair copulation, or EPC. Those are two terms I use throughout the chapter. How could we, including the biologists who spend their lives studying these birds, have been so wrong about what monogamy means in these birds? And it's because we believed, or I should say assumed, that lifelong or seasonal coupling and joint commitment to childbearing was accompanied by sexual exclusivity. But in fact, as Professor Sue Carter wrote in The Monogamy Paradox, this assumption has repeatedly been shown to be incorrect. It seems remarkable that biologists were unaware of this until just 35 years ago, but a simple literature search reveals the ignorance. If you search Google Scholar for birds extra-pair paternity from 1977 to 1987, it produces one scientific article. If you do that same search from 1988 to 1998, it produces 810 articles. Once again, blinded by bias, when scientists observed pair bonding in birds, we assumed that it was sexually monogamous, and only the conclusive nature of DNA forces us to see things as they really are. So, what even is monogamy? It's not that biologists were wrong about pair bonding in birds. We were wrong about what pair bonding really means because we confused social monogamy with sexual monogamy. Sexual monogamy is just what it sounds like, a bilateral relationship. It's just what it sounds like, sexual exclusivity. But the sexual exclusivity is what people hear when they come in mind, when they hear about monogamy, sexual monogamy. But sexual exclusivity is actually very rare in nature, almost non-existent. But social monogamy is quite common. It's also called economic monogamy, which I think also emphasizes its true nature. This is the tendency of animals, including humans, to pursue dyads that are enduring, marked by mutual aid and support, and that take priority over their other social relationships. Simply put, social monogamy is two individuals building a life together, most often for the purpose of raising children. They share and defend a home, nest, or territory. They share economic resources. They jointly contribute to the rearing of children, usually their own genetic offspring. And perhaps most importantly, they do so to the exclusion of others and for a substantial portion of their life history, if not perpetually. Because we tend to see life through our own lens, mammals often come to mind in discussions about monogamy, but the real stars of social and economy are the birds. Something like 90% of bird species form enduring dyads, with only 5% of mammal species doing so, and only 15% of primates. The reason for this is the unique way that bird embryos develop, externally, but with warmth required. Reptiles, amphibians, fish do not tend to their eggs once they are laid, since they don't require warmth. So therefore, dyads are just not a thing in those species for the most part. Mammals are at the other extreme where they carry their developing embryos inside their body. So while partnerships can be helpful, they're usually not required. Birds, however, are in what I call the monogamous middle. This is because in order for bird eggs to develop properly, they must be incubated constantly, and they also must be protected from egg predators. So in other words, someone must be sitting on the eggs pretty much all the time until they hatch. And the work isn't finished then either, right? The brood continues to need warmth and protection as their tiny bodies grow, and also, food. So what is a bird mother to do while tending to her eggs and hatchlings for all those weeks? A friend to help with the food, water, and defense would sure be helpful. What friend would selflessly help in this way? Why, the other genetic parent of the egg, of course. So eggs and offspring represent an intertwining of the evolutionary interests of both parents. And in fact, in most bird species, the males and females divide the work more or less equally. While one parent sits on the eggs, the other forages for food for them both, and they usually take turns. It's a true partnership in which both parties contribute to the care and defense of the fledglings. And this is why monogamous male-female dyads are so common in birds. It's the partnership that is the most free of reproductive conflict. A single parent would struggle to stay alive, but a partnership of more than two would breed reproductive competition, if you'll pardon the pun. Two is just right. Well, most of the time, because variations do exist. And of course, I go on to talk about a lot of those variations. The permanency of bird dyads, however, is another story. The lifestyle of migratory birds is highly seasonal. Nests are built and eggs are laid in the springtime. Summer is for raising chicks. Fall is for finding someplace warm for the winter, and so on. And therefore, the partnerships are often seasonal as well, with about half of the bird species displaying seasonal monogamy. Once the chicks leave the nest, the dyad dissolves and the cycle of courtship and mating begins anew. Now, it is true that some dyads in some bird species are permanent, but the discovery of these lifelong bird marriages in the 19th century was overgeneralized because Victorians were all too eager to see in nature what they valued in human society, which is fidelity and permanency. But we now know that the seasonal monogamy of birds is akin to serial monogamy in humans, if we use today's vocabulary. And as we will soon discuss, even staunchly economically monogamous birds are not sexually monogamous usually. Okay, then I'm going to skip for a little bit and go to an example of, because why a male bird would sleep around is fairly obvious. Most people would kind of understand. Of course, you want to spread your genes to as many females as possible in the best hope of blah, blah, blah. So then, but we've all focused so much on males that a lot of times the females are just seen as these hapless victims who just, oh, oops, well, I wish you weren't doing that, but actually, if we really look at what females are doing, which we're finally starting to do, it's a much more complicated story. And so I begin. For females, it's a different story. She cannot just spread her eggs around that the males, the way that the males can spread their sperm around. She actually can through brood parasitism, but that section got cut from the book because the editor thought it was distracting. Anyway, when she has an EPC, an extra pair copulation, she must continue to carry the embryo inside her until she lays the egg, which she then must incubate, defend, and eventually feed. For this reason, females are more choosy than males when it comes to EPCs because they must bear the costs, quite literally, of any offspring that result, whereas a male may not have to. There's no free lunch for the females. Or is there? Most bird species do not lay a single clutch of eggs at once, but rather they lay eggs repeatedly over a short period of time. Bluebirds, for example, lay one egg per day for up to a week. And out of a desire to have these eggs synchronized in their development, she does not begin to incubate them until she has laid them all. During this egg-laying period, she is free to pursue copulations and diversify the paternity of her clutch, and that is precisely what she tries to do. In warmer climates, robins can take things even further and complete several successive cycles of reproduction in a single season, building a nest, laying eggs, and caring for the chicks until they fly away before repeating the process a second or third time with a variety of paternity. But what is the advantage of having a clutch with multiple fathers? For a male, his EPC could result in having many more offspring, but for a female, the limiting factor is how many is her ability to produce eggs. And in the interest of time, I got to skip through some stuff. But the advantages are twofold. First of all, there's no such thing as one best male, right? All males have a combination of traits. Of course, she's going to look for the best male, but what the best male is can change from season to season, year to year, decade to decade, because the environment is always changing. So who is best in any one environment will also change. And so evolution has rewarded a desire for promiscuity as a way to diversify the genetics of your offspring. So that's advantage number one. Advantage number two is, one thing that scientists have noticed, this is particularly shown in jackdaws, is that while the male bird was off provisioning food and the female was waiting, sometimes another male would come back and feed that female. It's not random who it was. That male previously mated with her. So a female sleeping around doesn't just diversify her clutch, she also gains provisions from those males who might feed her a little bit. Now they don't feed her as much as they feed their primary partner, because most of them will have a primary partner too. But it's like they're all playing a little bit of evolutionary hedge investment with each other, right? And of course scientists, when they first started to discover this, describe it as cheating, and they call them cuckolds, and they use all those kind of moralizing words, and assuming that deception is at play. But there's nothing to say that this isn't all in the open, right? It doesn't mean there won't be conflict. It doesn't mean that you're not going to try to jockey for the best position. But females and males both have an advantage in diversifying the clutch and then trying to support their offspring. They will also try to resist their mate from doing the same. So we're right back to the battle of the sexes. It's just without this moralizing idea about monogamy being the ideal, because it's certainly not, at least in any of the species that we look at. So that's all I can talk about today. I was ready to talk about lots of other things, but I'm out of time. But I'll take any questions that we have. Yes?
What is the, I mean, if a female is going to sleep with someone other than her primary partner, she obviously has to deceive her primary partner, because if he knows what's going on, he's not going to help her.
Okay. See, what you just said, I don't believe that's true at all. I don't think she has to deceive it. Now, she might not want to be brazen about it, because the primary male might come in and try to stop it. However, and this was another section that I was going to read in the interest of time, but let me read it to you now. Well, actually, no, let me just summarize it, because that'll take too long. So these are the first two species that paternity was discovered in, the extrapair paternity. In jackdaws, as I mentioned, when the female has another male that is not her primary partner, and they have sex, they copulate, it is loud and vocal. There are copulatory calls that they make. If she were trying to deceive, wouldn't they like whisper?
Yeah.
No, she's as loud as possible. Why do you think she's loud? Because it gets him back, her primary partner back, quickly. And then he quickly copulates with her to try to get the sperm out from the previous one. So that's her way of doing two potential things, either diversifying with this other male or getting the other male back so he'll stop copulating with others, which he's going to provision food for later. You see what I mean? Like, it's tension, it's conflict, but it's not necessarily deceptive. Or
what if you have a male who just goes around and tries to do nothing but extra pair copulations,
and then never
and then never warm any eggs?
Okay, but courtship is part of the pair. So again, you're separate copulations from pair bonding. Pair bonding is what courtship is about. Your courtship, you're usually songs, dances, whatever. They decide on each other, and then they build a nest together. So the investment starts even before the eggs are laid, right? And so if he were to then do all that work with a mated partner and then not come back, his offspring are in there too. They're mostly his, right? He's going to try to sneak and get some more, but obviously most of his investment is
What
here.
if he just doesn't build any nests and just run around and try to sleep with them?
But that's a poor strategy, because at best he's going to get an offspring here or there with whatever female he can find. But remember, the best females are the ones that, because there is still competition, right? Intrasexual competition. So they're still looking for quality, right? And a male that's just going around or whatever is not a high quality male. If it were to his advantage to do that, that's what they would do. But it is in his advantage to have the best primary partner he can and then try to sprinkle some extra parent maternity.
There might be a tiny percentage that does that, though.
Sure. Yes, actually, that's a good point. That's a variation also, right? And behavioral variation is one of the themes of the book, where it is kind of like a blind punching around, and whatever works, works. And that's the genius of natural selection, right? Everything becomes a product of its own success, whether it's positive or negative. So if it's not successful, then that strategy doesn't persist. If it is successful, it does.
So how does...
Oh, sorry. I got one and then the other. Sorry, I didn't.
And I know you've written about several species, but I question how relevant to us is bird mating. I mean,
Okay.
We're pretty far apart.
Yes, I talk about that. So I use birds in this section to introduce monogamy and the different facets of it. Very quickly after that, I get into mammals. And the problem, though, is that our closest relatives do not form dyads. Chimpanzees do not form dyads. Neither species of chimpanzee forms dyads. So if we're using dyads as the thing we want to study, you get no help from chimpanzees, which is really strange because they have a lot of sex. And they have a lot of social cohesion. They really care about their social partners, and they form affiliations and groups. Bonobos, the penguin chimpanzees, are very female-oriented in their hierarchy, whereas the common chimpanzees are very male-oriented. Either way, though, all of their alliances and bonds include sex and in no way
So
exclusive.
they're part of like a collective of...
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, with their bonding, yes, with social bonding, yes. And again, there's jockeying for power and position. I mean, there's definitely a dominance hierarchy, and bonobos use sex to climb the ladder. I have a whole section on that. But there's not the pair bonding. Now, our next closest living relatives are the gorillas. So I spent a little bit more time with gorillas. The problem is gorillas are polygynous. So you have a single male, but he is pair bonded with multiple females. And that is, it's not sexually exclusive, but there is a real social relationship. They spend a lot of time in affectionate contact and blah, blah, blah. And those, of course, are the mothers of his children. So that's a better example in terms of the sexual bonding that happens, because it's, but. Yeah.
One more question.
Mm-hmm.
How does a female bird recognize a high-quality male?
Well,
In other words, I'm asking about
Yeah.
perception.
right.
I'm not asking about the
So-
details of it.
Right. So in a lot of species, studying their quality assurance or quality assessments is a big part of research. So a lot of birds, they use songs, and you're like, why would songs make a good male? Well, first of all, there's the whole sexy son hypothesis that whatever it is, if that bird has it, then their sons will have it, and that's what's attractive. Things just become attractive for their own sake, like the tail of the peacock, right? That's one reason. But the other thing is that it's a quality assurance, because if you can sing 200 songs, like many of them do, then you've got a lot of gray matter. You're a smart bird. And a lot of them will defend territory. Why is territory important? Because you have to be strong and healthy and have good genes in order to do it. It's a proxy measure. Walruses do the same thing, where you have these big walruses, and they won't eat or sleep for weeks, and they defend a territory called a rookery. But that territory is only for mating. After it's over, they're all back into friendly social contact again. So what's the purpose of the territory? You don't get anything for it, but it's a proxy indicator of how good that male is at being a walrus. You see what I'm saying? So like, it's like a wrestling match, or it's like deer that fight with their antler. It's a proxy indicator of how strong that male is, because you have to be strong and healthy to survive it.
So it's the length of the behavior in time.
That potentially, yeah, that's endurance, right? So you have to be healthy and strong and to do that, but also you have to be smart, right, in order to sing those songs or defend that territory. Like, think of all of the skills that are necessary to defend the territory if you're a bird, because some birds are wickedly territorial. And think of all of the physical skills that are necessary to defend against encroachment. So visual has to be top-notch. Your motor control has to be top-notch. You have to be aggressive. You have to recognize who's a real threat and who's not, right? Think of all of the cognitive skills that are necessary.
This seems to bear on what the female bird can perceive, can, in a sense, understand.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's instinctual, right? It's not like they have a notepad and they're like, but like.
No, I understand it, but it seems to be that the most obvious one is persistent.
I think that's a big part of it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, endurance.
Right.
Yeah, sorry, I'm on overtime.
Yeah, it's
It's
okay.
their fault.
Yeah, I think what the